Mariah Carey. This is how Mariah Carey looked in her prime. Today, she's 57 and still the songbird supreme. Whitney Houston. This is how Whitney Houston looked in her prime. The world lost her in 2012 at just 48. Celine Dion. This is how Celine Dion looked in her prime. Today, she's 58 and fighting her way back to the stage. Madonna. This is how Madonna looked in her prime. Today, she's 67 and still commanding world stages. Janet Jackson. This is how Janet Jackson looked in her prime. Today, she's 60 and still as fierce as ever. Toni Braxton. This is how Toni Braxton looked in her prime. Today, she's 58 and still turning heads everywhere. Aaliyah. This is how Aaliyah looked in her prime. The world lost her tragically in 2001 at just 22. Alanis Morissette. This is how Alanis Morissette looked in her prime. Today, she's 51 and just entered the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Mary J. Blige. This is how Mary J. Blige looked in her prime. Today, she's 55 and still the queen of hip-hop soul. Shania Twain. This is how Shania Twain looked in her prime. Today, she's 60 and still looking absolutely phenomenal. TLC. T-Boz and Chili. This is how TLC looked in their prime. Today, T-Boz is 56 and Chili is 55, still carrying Left Eye's legacy forward. Beyoncé. This is how a teenage Beyoncé looked in her prime. Today, she's 44 and the biggest artist on the planet. Spice Girls. This is how the Spice Girls looked in their prime. Today, each one has built her own legendary career. Selena Quintanilla. This is how Selena Quintanilla looked in her prime. The world lost its Queen of Tejano at just 23. Lauryn Hill. This is how Lauryn Hill looked in her prime. Today, she's 51 and her music still outsells generations. Sheryl Crow. This is how Sheryl Crow looked in her prime. Today, she's 64, a cancer survivor and the Rock Hall of Famer. Gwen Stefani. This is how Gwen Stefani looked in her prime. Today, she's 56 and still a global fashion icon. Brandy. This is how Brandy looked in her prime. Today, she's 47 and still known as the vocal Bible. Monica. This is how Monica looked in her prime. Today, she's 45 and still a powerhouse in R&B. Faith Evans. This is how Faith Evans looked in her prime. Today, she's 52 and still recording and touring. En Vogue. This is how En Vogue looked in their prime. Today, they're still performing and those harmonies never stopped. Sarah McLachlan. This is how Sarah McLachlan looked in her prime. Today, she's 58 and more radiant than ever. Fiona Apple. This is how Fiona Apple looked in her prime. Today, she's 48 and still one of music's most respected artists. Jewel. This is how Jewel looked in her prime. Today, she's 52 and fans say she looks exactly the same. Erykah Badu. This is how Erykah Badu looked in her prime. Today, she's 55 and still the coolest woman in music. Missy Elliott. This is how Missy Elliott looked in her prime. Today, she's 54 and a Rock and Roll Hall of Famer. Shakira. This is how Shakira looked in her prime. Today, she's 49 and her hips still don't lie. Jennifer Lopez. This is how Jennifer Lopez looked in her prime. Today, she's 56 and still one of the most photographed women alive. Kelly Rowland. This is how Kelly Rowland looked in her prime. Today, she's 45 and shining brighter than ever. The Chicks, Dixie Chicks. This is how the Dixie Chicks looked in their prime. Today, as the Chicks, they're older, bolder, and still unafraid. Cher. This is how Cher looked in her 90s comeback. Today, she's 79 and somehow still completely ageless. Natalie Imbruglia. This is how Natalie Imbruglia looked in her prime. Today, she's 51 and fans say she still looks breathtaking. Tracy Chapman. This is how Tracy Chapman looked in her prime. Today, she's 62 and still giving the world goosebumps. Paula Cole. This is how Paula Cole looked in her prime. Today, she's 58, and history calls her a true pioneer. Dolores O'Riordan. This is how Dolores O'Riordan looked in her prime. The world lost her in 2018 at just 46. Lisa Loeb. This is how Lisa Loeb looked in her prime. Today, she's 58 and still radiating that same timeless charm. Annie Lennox. This is how Annie Lennox looked in her prime. Today, she's 71 and still one of the most powerful voices alive. SVW. This is how SVW looked in their prime. Today, they're still performing, and those harmonies never stopped. Lisa Stansfield. This is how Lisa Stansfield looked in her prime. Today, she's 60 and still impossibly chic.